Have you ever wondered who the real, historical Jesus was? Beyond the stained glass windows and ancient scriptures, what can historians actually tell us about the man from Nazareth? It's a fascinating question that takes us on a journey through ancient texts, archaeology, and some serious scholarly detective work. Today, we're peeling back the layers of faith and legend to uncover the Jesus of history. First off, let's address the big question: did Jesus even exist? The overwhelming consensus among mainstream historians, both secular and religious, is yes. While we don't have a birth certificate or a driver's license, the evidence is compelling enough that very few scholars in the relevant fields argue he was a complete myth. The debate isn't about his existence, but about the details of his life and what we can know for certain. So, where does this evidence come from? Our primary sources are, of course, the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But historians don't read these as straightforward biographies. They see them as theological documents, written decades after Jesus' death by authors with a specific message to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah. They weren't trying to write a neutral, objective history lesson. Because of this, scholars use a set of tools called historical criteria to sift through the Gospels. One of the most important is the criterion of embarrassment. The idea is that if a story would have been embarrassing or difficult for the early Christian community, it's more likely to be true. Why would they invent something that made them look bad or complicated their message? For example, Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. In early Christian theology, Jesus was seen as superior to John. So, having Jesus submit to John's baptism, a ritual for the forgiveness of sins, was awkward. The fact that all the Gospels include it suggests it really happened. They couldn't just ignore a well-known fact. Another key source is the Apostle Paul. His letters are actually the earliest Christian writings we have, predating the Gospels by about 10 to 20 years. Paul never met the historical Jesus, but he knew his brother James and his chief disciple, Peter. While Paul is more concerned with theology than biography, his letters confirm key details: that Jesus was a real man, that he was called the Christ, that he had disciples, that he was betrayed, and that he was crucified. This early, independent attestation is incredibly valuable for historians. But what about non-Christian sources? They're rare, but they exist, and they're crucial. The most famous is from a 1st century Roman Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 AD, he mentions Jesus twice. One passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is controversial because most scholars believe it was later altered by Christian scribes who added phrases like "he was the Christ." However, by removing the obvious Christian additions, scholars think they can get back to an original, more neutral core. This core likely mentioned that Jesus was a wise man and teacher who was crucified under Pontius Pilate at the instigation of some Jewish leaders. Josephus also mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, which independently confirms Jesus had a brother named James and was known as the Christ. Another Roman historian, Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, also mentions Jesus. When describing Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Tacitus explains where the name Christians came from. He writes that their founder, Christus, was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate in Judea during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus was no friend to Christians. He called their faith a deadly superstition, which makes his testimony even more powerful. He had no reason to make this up. He was simply reporting the origins of this group that he despised. So, putting all these pieces together, what kind of picture emerges of the historical Jesus? He was a Galilean Jew who lived in the early 1st century, during a time of significant social and political tension under Roman occupation. He was likely a carpenter or artisan, a common trade in the area. At some point in his late 20s or early 30s, he began a public ministry as an itinerant preacher and healer. He gathered a group of close followers, both men and women, and attracted large crowds. His central message appears to have been about the kingdom of God. This was a powerful and ambiguous phrase. For some, it might have sounded like a call for political revolution against Rome. For others, it was about a spiritual transformation and inner renewal. Jesus taught using parables, short, memorable stories that challenged conventional wisdom and forced listeners to think. He seems to have had a special concern for the poor, the marginalized, and the outcasts of society, often criticizing the religious elite for their hypocrisy and rigid interpretation of the law. His ministry was relatively short, maybe only 1 to 3 years. The final week of his life is the most detailed part of the gospel narratives. He traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, a time of high patriotic and religious fervor. There, his actions, like his dramatic confrontation in the temple precinct, were seen as a direct challenge to the authority of both the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and the temple leadership. This led to his arrest and execution. Crucifixion was a specifically Roman method of punishment. Reserved for slaves, rebels, and non-Roman citizens, it was designed to be a public, humiliating, and agonizing deterrent. The fact that Jesus was crucified by the Romans strongly suggests they saw him as a potential threat to public order, a possible insurrectionist. The charge placed over his cross, King of the Jews, was meant as a mockery, a warning to anyone else who might challenge Roman rule. Now, what about the miracles and the resurrection? This is where history and faith diverge. Historians, by the nature of their discipline, can't prove or disprove supernatural events. They can't run a lab test on turning water into wine or walking on water. What a historian can say is that Jesus had a reputation as a powerful healer and exorcist. In an age before modern medicine, the line between physical and spiritual ailment was blurry, and many figures were known as healers. Whether these were psychosomatic cures or something more, his followers certainly believed he had extraordinary powers. The resurrection is the foundational belief of Christianity, but it is an event that lies beyond the reach of historical verification. Historians can study the aftermath. They can confirm that Jesus' followers, who had scattered in fear after his crucifixion, were suddenly and dramatically re-energized. They became convinced that he had been raised from the dead and appeared to them. This belief, whatever its origin, transformed them from a terrified, defeated group into a movement that would eventually change the world. A historian can analyze their testimony and the rapid spread of their message, but they cannot historically prove that the resurrection itself happened. That remains a matter of faith. So, the historical Jesus was a real person. He was a Jewish apocalyptic prophet and teacher from Galilee. He preached about the kingdom of God, challenged the authorities, and was executed by the Romans. His followers' profound belief that he was resurrected launched the Christian faith. This historical portrait might be different from the one you're used to, and it's certainly more complex. It's built not on certainty, but on probability, on weighing the evidence and making the most reasonable conclusions. It shows us a figure deeply embedded in the world of first-century Judaism, a charismatic and courageous man whose short life and brutal death left an impact unlike any other in human history. The quest for the historical Jesus is a constant process of discovery, and it reminds us that behind the global religion lies a compelling and very human story. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.